Welcome to another edition of Against the Current, coming to you from atop the Old Republic building at the Skyline Club in downtown Chicago. Pleased to have as our guest on this edition, Sean Spicer, press secretary for the Trump presidency, the Trump administration. The book, New York Times bestseller, The Briefing. Sean, thanks so much for joining us.
Dan,
Appreciate
thanks for having me.
And by the way, I appreciate you not bringing the Antifa advance team. We try and keep these confines dignified, so the rabble,
You bet.
not so much. So been a whirlwind 3 years from you, from RNC Comms director to President Trump's press secretary, to The Briefing, the bestseller. If you had to do it all over again, going from RNC Comms director to the Trump administration, would you do it the same?
No. I mean, would I do it? Yeah, but I don't think that anybody can hopefully you don't look back on your life and say, I do everything the same. There's things I would improve or change. I don't look back with regret on anything in the sense of saying I wouldn't do it, but there's plenty of times where I had an interaction or a moment that I said, wow, I probably could have done that better.
This isn't Megyn Kelly or the BBC. We're not going to pour over the nonsense about aerial shots of the inauguration.
It's all in the book.
Obsessing about this. It's rather absurd, and I know there's an accounting for it in the book, but the obsession with that on your whirlwind press tour, has he been warmly received by the press corps?
Well, I mean, I knew some of that was coming, but to your point, I think there's this sense of everyone wanting to relitigate it so that they feel like they got their punch in.
Yeah.
Which is fine. I mean, look, in most cases, their show, it's your show. You get to ask questions you want. I'm here on my own accord. I think so.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, but I think you're right. It's like how many times they each want to ask the question over again. And I think to some degree it kind of proves my point that I make in the book, which is that these guys, they're not necessarily looking to further a story or an issue as much as, settle scores or make it very clear who they're for and against.
I mean, imagine some propagandizing coming from a presidential administration. I mean, this is unheard of.
Right. Well, the funny part is that at one point someone said to me, have you ever exaggerated or whatever? And I said, well, I mean, with all due respect, that's what PR people do. I mean, they go out there and you say, we put your best foot forward. No PR person gets out there and says, as a press secretary, well, let me tell you all the bad, too.
Yes.
I mean, that's right. The job of the press is to ask the tough questions, uncover the stuff, but your job is to put, the best spin on an issue or an announcement or a policy as that you can. That's what you do. You go out there and advocate for things.
Well, and also, too, it's your job is not to say, thank you all for coming today. I'd like to tell you where I disagree with my client.
Right. No.
I disagree with my boss.
I think to some degree, anyone who thinks of the tenure of a press secretary who goes out and says, look, the president believes the following. Here's why I think he's wrong.
Let's debate the issue.
Right, yeah. Look, here's some issues that I think he should have thought of first. I don't think you'd last too long in the job. That is not the nature of it. And I know that the press corps, especially the Washington press corps, by and large, wants that. Because fundamentally, this is what it comes down to. They don't like him. They don't like conservatives. And so they want you to be not a spokesperson, but rather an apologist.
So just a little bit more explication on that point, the job of the press secretary, because Trump is sort of a black swan event, arguably.
Oh, I think unequivocally.
Unequivocally, okay, all right. And so you coming as basically a career PR guy, comms guy on the Hill in the private sector, but especially on the Hill, then at the RNC, you're sort of an inside guy. You know the inside players, you know the game on Capitol Hill. In comes this outside force, and then the inside guy meets the outside guy. That's a little bit a little bit uneven and just kind of the inside-outside dynamic. But that's sort of what it was.
That's fair.
And so how do you sort of reconcile all the relationships you have on the inside with the outside force?
It's a great question, Dan, because it truly is that, right? I had spent a career building relationships with a lot of these folks, with a lot of the establishment, if you will, because that was my job.
Right.
And here you have this outside force, Donald Trump. The real difference is the dynamic. And it's true with the press, donors, and K Street. Normally, regardless of party, if you're a presidential candidate and eventually the president, you need those forces. They're part of the equation. You need donors that want to feel important, and so every candidate goes out and makes them feel important, and the K Street folks who make the wheels turn, same kind of stuff, and especially the media. With all three of those groups, Trump basically came in and said, I don't need you guys. I mean, to some degree, clearly he does, but his attitude was, I know what I want to say, I've got a platform, Twitter and other accounts that I can make it, so I don't need you. And that relationship suddenly changed, where the press always felt needed and wanted. And I think under Trump, the dynamic was just totally different. And that was what made the big difference, is that there were all these procedures and historical norms that were supposed to be followed, and Trump's view was, I don't have to, I'm not necessarily going to abide by them. And for the press corps, who was used to having people kind of kowtow towards them, where they wanted to come in, the dynamic flipped. They wanted to now get in the room more than the politician wanted them in the room.
As a political animal, were you cognizant of all of the people that Trump brought into the Republican Party to vote for him as president, and that part of the audience to whom you were speaking was that Trump voter that's a recent confirmed convert to the Republican Party?
I think, honestly, it was an evolving dynamic, right? Because I started this and I prepared for it traditionally. I talked to press secretaries on both sides of the aisle. I practiced with my team how to do briefings and started to get a handle, met with the White House Correspondents Association in terms of how things are supposed to work. But I don't think I fully appreciated Trump's disruptive nature and how he wasn't as concerned with the historical norms as I did. One of the things that I talk about in the book that I set out to change right off the bat was the press corps had this sort of stranglehold on how briefings would go. So they sort of determined that the Associated Press got called on first, and then when they felt as though enough of their questions had been answered, whoever was sitting in the Associated Press chair that day would say, "Thank you very much." And that was a signal that your press conference was over. And so on day one, the first thing I did was called on the New York Post. And among the press corps, if you didn't get the game, then it didn't make, no one got it was sort of a dog whistle to the press corps, which was, things have changed. Then about 45, 50 minutes in the press conference, you can hear the Associated Press reporter say, "Thank you very much, Sean." The signal normally would be to end the press conference. And I looked down and I said, "Thank you very much. I'm going to keep going." And part of it was a subtle but clear signal to the press corps that was assembled in that room, that had known the rules and the historical norms that went back decades, that this is how it worked, to subtly say to them, things are changing. A new sheriff's in town. The Trump administration is not so much concerned with how it's been done in the past. We started calling on folks in the back of the room, right? So in the front of the press briefing room, if you ever watch, it's the big networks, the big newspapers, and the wire services. They, by tradition, get called on first. My view was, not anymore. They don't necessarily, their voice isn't any more important than your radio show, or a local newspaper, or a financial outlet, or what have you, a niche paper of some sort. Everybody had a voice. More people had sort of tuned into this election, conservative media in particular, that hadn't been felt welcome necessarily in that press briefing room, especially in the last years of Obama. So my view was that they all represent a constituency, many that voted for Trump, and they have a right to have their questions asked and answered.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of those questions, locally or regionally or nationally, from non-traditional sources, weren't just weaned from internet memes and Instagram posts. So, I thought that's probably nice.
But it's also like
from actual human beings.
Right, and the thing that was interesting is I remember in particular that I write about this in the book, that there was one station that I called out west, who was really concerned about land issues, and the federal government owns massive amounts of land in places like Nevada and Utah.
Just ask Clive Bundy's. Yeah, right.
And so part of it was having those issues brought up, also, frankly, informed the other reporters. It got them to hear about an issue that was of concern that might not permeate the sort of elite Washington media.
There were questions other than about how you think of the press.
Right.
So, the actual concerns of, American families.
Right, and that was the thing, is that if you actually stop for a moment and listen to a briefing one day, the same question gets asked over and over again almost by every one of those reporters in the front. They just want their opportunity to ask the same question because they're being filmed and they want to be able to use it on their air or on a cable news program that they're appearing on later or whatever.
Yeah.
They're not actually, for the most part, interested in actually furthering a story or getting information because they've had all day to do that.
Although I am excited always to see like what pocket square Jim Acosta is wearing. So that's kind of fun. It becomes a little bit of a drinking game of sorts.
Well, in the middle of the day, that's a little.
Well, I mean, you know, if you don't start in the middle of the day, you can't drink all day.
That's good.
I thank you very much. You know, it's me. I'm talking about me as a radio guy. You know, I'm done at 9 a.m. I got nothing but time to kill until 5 a.m.
Now it makes sense.
Yeah,
it makes sense.
This is how we do
It's
it.
a good thing you don't have an evening show.
Exactly. So, but I want to go back to the inside-outside thing. So, what was the learning curve? You mentioned you kind of underestimated how much of a disruptive agent Trump was going to be. What was the learning curve for you in that post as press secretary?
Admittedly, I think it was fairly steep, and I'll explain why. So let's say that you were, you knew that you were going to get a bunch of questions on a particular issue, say Afghanistan. You would prepare by having your press kind of come up with some, reasonable responses and messaging on that. And then you would bring in the relevant experts from the National Security Agency or the National Security Council and say, hey, this is maybe the State Department, say, hey, look, we know we're going to get these questions on Afghanistan today. Here's what we want to say. And then they would say, okay, well, U.S. policy is going to be this, and here's how we can craft it. And you go, okay, great. What I started to realize quickly was that the president's view was, I don't necessarily, that may not how I want to communicate my administration. That may have been how Obama and Bush and everyone else wanted to do it, sort of state U.S. government policy. But this president is very particular about the words that are used to describe the views that he has vis-a-vis any particular issue. So I started preparing as a lot of previous press secretaries did, which was to gather the information and figure out what the position of the U.S. government was. The problem is that this president really wasn't concerned necessarily what a bunch of bureaucrats thought as much as he was saying, okay, I was elected. People want to know what I think about this issue or how I'm going to implement a policy. And so he started to play a much more personal role in the messaging.
Well, the other challenge, it would seem to me, is that you would have to convene that group about 3 hours earlier than normal because he's tweeting at 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning about these topics.
Well, and one of the things that you start to, people ask me all the time about the tweets. The one thing that initially, you're right, you would wake up and go, okay, this is going to be interesting. If you're a press guy, one of the things that you realize, and it's not, frankly, it wasn't initially apparent, is that it makes it a lot easier if he's stating his position on a policy or a person or what have you. Because your job as the press person is to speak on his behalf. If he's already tweeting it, here's what I think on this issue or here's what I think on this person, then your job is a lot easier because he's already made his position crystal clear in 140 and 280 characters, what it is. And you don't, when people ask you, well, what does he think? You go, look, he tweeted about it. That's what he thinks. And it was an adjustment, but you had to learn to embrace it, to say, hey, it's actually easier to embrace the tweet and say, okay, now I know exactly what he thinks. I might not have been in the loop before he tweeted it, but there's no question what he thinks.
So how did you sort of think about how your relationship and your kind of approach to the DC press corps in terms of combativeness? I mean, Sarah Huckabee Sanders is combative too. I mean, she stands her ground the same way you did. I mean, you're different personalities, you're different people, but she stands her ground, you stood your ground. But the idea that, look, I'm here to communicate his views, and the DC press corps' attitude about someone in your position changed, where you weren't in this role to do a job they're very familiar with, but you were sort of part of this evil cabal.
Right.
And so you were to be held accountable for everything that was said or done by the principal.
Correct. And I think that was the point, is that their view was, we don't like him or his views or how he's acting, and we'll take it out through you. So I became the manifestation of everything that they found wrong with that. And so every day became more and more combative. And that's not, I mean, I knew that there would be sort of a back and forth, but I think the level of vitriol and personal attacks was not something that I even came close to anticipating.
How did all of those relationships that you had developed over 2 decades as a communications professional on the Hill, both with Republican caucuses on the Hill, and frankly, probably even some Democrats, I assume, as well as the media, how did that change when you transitioned from the RNC to this position?
So it actually evolved before that. When I went up and started working on the campaign, a lot more on a full-time basis in August. There was a lot of D.C. folks, especially on the Republican side, that very publicly said, you know, I can't believe you're throwing away your career. I can't believe you're getting in bed with this guy to defend these crazy views. And then when he won, it switched a little, because of course everyone realized, okay, I need to get back on board. And there was a lot of, you know, congratulations, and, you know, we realized that
Sure.
Hillary was bad and blah, 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 blah. And so there was a bit of a shift. But I think for some folks, and then definitely for the media, there was this sense of, like I mentioned earlier, it became very personal, because they, I think, tolerated conservatives and Republicans but they were all convinced Hillary was going to win. And I think there was a sense of shattering. There's a book by one of the New York Times reporters that came out, and they were convinced that, you know, Hillary was going to be the first woman president and break the glass ceiling and all this. I mean, they were excited and giddy because of the prospect of a Hillary Clinton presidency. So this idea of a Trump presidency really reversed a lot of what they believed was going to happen, and I think they were not pleased with it, and it made that there was a lot of tension.
And they expected you to apologize.
Correct. There was this sense that I should go in and be an apologist for him. And the thing that I found most fascinating,
or for the American electorate,
right? But the thing that I thought was most fascinating to me was, here were most of these guys who were proven very wrong on the election. It wasn't like this narrow victory. I mean, 306 electoral votes, states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania are hardly Republican strangleholds. And so they were very, very wrong. And my thought would be, okay, if you were that wrong, that big, you might want to sort of recognize, hey, I don't think I've got a pulse on what's happening in the country right now. Because clearly they missed a lot of this. As we sort of would go around and try to talk to them about what we were seeing, we were largely dismissed. So I sort of found it fascinating to me that they would double down. Instead of being like, okay, we missed this. We don't see what's going on in this country. Clearly we're not seeing how Trump connected to so many voters that we missed. They doubled down and said, we've got to figure out a way to basically be against him.
Well, and I wonder if you see this the same way I do. What I see in response to that is some think pieces in the Atlantic and the New York Times and the Amazon Post about the bubbles we live in, and CNN town halls with Trump voters to sort of probe their minds and how they change over time on particular issues. I see it as sort of the typical politicians pandering from the DC press corps outlets, sort of paying pro forma respect to people who they don't agree with and they don't understand, but they're going to give them a little bit of a platform, largely for the purposes of dismissing them.
I think at the beginning that was true, but I think even more so now. If you look at both MSNBC and CNN, there's save one or two people. You can't. I mean, I don't think on MSNBC there's a single Trump supporter. They get Republicans who admittedly are never Trumpers, and the same thing on CNN. They do have a couple that I can think of, but not many. And to your point, they marginalize them. They are consistently trying to figure out, how do we check a box so that it's 4 or 5 against 1 on a panel, but we can say this voice was represented. When you have Republicans filling a panel, but all of them are against Trump, that's hardly a balanced view. I mean, I remember I turned on the television, this is 2 or 3 Saturdays ago, and there was a 4-panel box, and the host said, we have 4 reporters covering this issue from every angle. And yet every story was about why Trump, this was, I think, about immigration or whatever. But there was not one that attempted to at least look at it from the administration standpoint.
All the shades of anti-Trump,
right. It was sort of like,
angle.
Here's the really, really don't like him view, and then here's the just kind of don't like him, and a couple in between.
Well, and look, I've got to admit, when Trump descended down that escalator when he made his announcement, I was in the Kevin Williamson camp of ape goes down escalator, witless ape, I think, even. I was not a Trump supporter. I didn't believe in this. I thought it was, kind of celebutant flimflammery of the sign that left practices, and I don't want to play cult of personality politics as a conservative. But I have to also admit, by the time of the Iowa caucus, I thought, this is real. Something's happening.
Right. Well, I was going to say, right around Iowa, New Hampshire, people started to go,
this is like,
okay, he's in it.
This is a real thing. And it wasn't that there weren't other legitimate conservative reform candidates in the race. My first choice was Scott Walker. and then I morphed to Ted Cruz when it was Cruz and Trump. But there was something that I think we were all missing, people that are in the media, even on the conservative side, and in politics as operatives on the conservative side. And I think you have to pay some tribute to that and some respect to it and think about it. And frankly, I don't know about you, but I've been pleasantly surprised by Trump, however maybe the vice has forced him to be more conservative than I thought he was going to be, a conservative reform president.
Right. I think one of the things that's interesting, because there's this vocal minority of never Trumpers that still exists.
Yeah.
Okay. And the thing that I find interesting is that a lot of those folks have been championing certain causes for a long time. The judiciary, the regulatory state, all of these things. And I go, okay, what you really have a problem with, and it's, I mean, I'm not saying it's illegitimate, but what it really comes down to is style. They don't, right, they don't like his style. And I look back and I kind of look at politics as this continuum, right? So here you have someone who says and does everything perfectly, and here you have someone getting results. And I've never seen the perfect, you know, the perfect middle. What it generally is that somewhere on the thing. So you can find someone like an Obama who talks fantastically. He's a great orator. He says everything. He can be inspiring. But the question is, did he really get things done? You have a lot of politicians that are good at talking, but they're not necessarily good at delivering results. I think the thing with Trump...
Or who've lived exemplary lives like Mitt Romney, but turned out, in my opinion, to be sort of a wooden, terrible candidate who frittered away his opportunity in 2012 at minimum.
Right. I mean, well, and I think we'll see what he does as a United States Senator, but I think that to the point, like I mean, we can go back and critique all of his race. I talk about this in the book. The fact that here's a guy, the difference between, at a very, very basic level, the difference between Romney and Trump is this. Trump embraced his success and his wealth and said, I am wealthy, I've made money, but I want you to make money. Romney almost acted as if he was ashamed that he had been successful.
Could you imagine Romney waving around his tax returns at his announcement press conference?
Right.
I mean, could you have a more stark contrast? And it seems to me that it's in addition to the idea of just embracing who you are and being authentically you, warts and all, it's the desperation, and we know this particularly poignantly in Illinois as an Illinois conservative Republican, is the desperation in trying to identify somebody that is actually going to put in the fight for people who believe the things that we believe against the established power structure. Right. We haven't had that in Illinois for a long time. We're desperate for it. I think was a feeling among the kind of conservative, small c grassroots around the country that we haven't had that for a long time. The Republican Party is a standard bearer, and Trump fit the bill.
He did. And that's why the thing that's so funny is that he taps into this working class sentiment throughout. And it was funny, I was reading this story about tariffs the other day, and these reporters have gone out to ag areas and said, you know, one headline today was, despite tariffs, you know, ag community still with Trump. And these reporters keep trying to get, you know, peel them away and say, like, how can you be for him? And I think for so many people, they might not even agree with some of the policies, but they're finally proud of somebody that's going out and fighting for them. They've been given excuses so many times and talking points about when something's not getting done. And I think the media is desperate to try to, they still don't get it. And you see this in these stories now where they kind of go out and say, you know, they're trying to basically make the case against him to all of these supporters and yet get baffled by the fact that they might have some short-term pain or might not fully reap the benefit of a policy for a while because Trump's out there saying, hey, I'm going to fight for you guys. I'm going to tear down these tariffs. I'm going to put in these retaliatory measures, whatever. But there's a case to be made that he's doing what they finally wanted. They wanted someone to go out there and fight for them. And the media cannot understand how they can still be with him.
I have grave concerns about Trump's gambits on trade policy. Larry Kudlow's presence allays those somewhat. I have grave concerns about some of his kind of interventionism with respect to kind of favored companies or industries. But I think the Republican Party for a long time has underestimated the power of people believing that this guy's on my side.
Right.
And I don't, you know, that's not the way I would do it, but I trust him because I think he's on my side, and I'm going to give him some bandwidth to try and get to the end point that we want to get to.
That's exactly right.
Right?
Yes. But because the flip side is what they've had for so long are people who said, you know, I kind of tried. I hear this all the time about
tried
people,
and surrendered.
But you know, you think
right.
about how many times people ask this about something that's going on in Washington. They'll say, why didn't they stay and fight? You know, they'll talk about fighting for certain funding or cutting spending, whatever, and they just give up. And there's always this question, well, why didn't they fight? And I understand that. For most conservatives, they're saying, I went out there, I knocked on doors, I fought to get you elected or reelected. Where are you fighting for me now? And I think there's that sense now with Trump that people feel like, you know what, the guy's willing to fight.
See, I know that like the DC press corps and the Celebutant press corps are so interested in the soap opera between you and Reince Priebus and what happened when he was removed and replaced and all that. But my thing is, from the perspective of the conservative grassroots, the Trump voter, where do you think this goes now? Do you think that Paul Ryan and the Wisconsin conservative reformers, Scott Walker included, I mean, the unbelievable turnaround in the Midwest led by the Mitch Danielses and the Mike Pences in Indiana and the Scott Walkers and the Paul Ryans and the Reince Priebuses in Wisconsin and others, do you think that they have, 18 months in, have sort of gotten the message and come Labor Day to November 6th, they're ready to prosecute the case against the Democrat socialists where all the energy is? Or are they still sort of trying to, I don't know, be liked or respected by the DC press corps?
I think there's a little, I think that one of the problems I have with a lot of Republicans writ large is what you're putting your finger on, is that they think somehow that if they do one more thing that these guys are going to like them. They don't, they are so afraid, they want to be liked by so many of the DC elite media. And the problem is, like I said earlier, most of them will tolerate you. They're never going to like you. And that's the difference. And one of the things that I've found, and this is like for a lot of my sort of colleagues that I've kind of grew up on the Hill with, that they sort of have this mentality that if they just do one more nice thing to this member of the press corps, if they just bend over the story a little bit further and try to, then the press will like them and like their stories. They're not, they are liberals for the most part. They're not going to ever like them. That being said, I think that for the most part, for lack of a better word, the establishment folks are getting the message that Trump's tapped into this. He has the second highest approval by party of any president save George W. Bush. The party's with him. And I think that what you've seen is candidates realize that if you're not with him, I mean, look at Mark Sanford.
Yeah.
He went out, taunted the guy. He had been a former governor, had held that seat before running for governor, then ran again for his old congressional seat, the 1st District of South Carolina, and he gets pounced on because he went against Trump. And Trump made it clear, okay, great. But the voters clearly know who Mark Sanford is in that district. They've been, electing him for years.
All about Mark Sanford.
Right.
Yeah.
And
right.
But the bottom line is that I think that the president has got, this massive part of the party that gets it and is with him. And politicians that stray now know that there's going to be consequences.
Do you see this as a realignment? Do you see this as, I mean, we were talking about Obama, Trump voters where for lack of a better generic description, the white working class, blue collar types have formally folded into the Republican Party?
I think that every president puts the stamp on their party. So Clinton, had been head of the Democratic Leadership Committee. Council, it was right. The party started to move a little to the left. They were concerned about whether they would forget their progressive roots, but didn't take long after he left office for it to sway back, and Obama clearly moved it in that direction, and you see it now getting tugged a little bit further. I think Bush moved it in a little of his direction. Trump's putting his stamp on it, but the party is somewhat elastic, that I think when that nominee goes away, or that president, then the next person that kind of comes up starts to put their stamp on it. So I think Trump will have a very populist stamp on the party. But there's also a realignment in the sense that I've been wondering lately that Republican orthodoxy on trade in particular has always been we support free trade blindly. We go in and no matter what the deal is. I've started to, people keep talking about how Trump's pulling the party. I actually wonder if Trump just recognized where the people were, that they had started to move away from where the orthodoxy and the platform of the party were to say that we want better trade deals, but that the politicians had just sort of blindly kept going with the policy that had been in place. and that Trump rather actually identifies where they had moved to. I think I've been very intrigued by that proposition over the last few months as I have time to think about it. And I wonder, beyond that though, you look at what he's done on the judiciary, something that has been advocated for by every conservative for years, what he's doing on taxes and on the economy, the deregulatory state, all of that has been unbelievably Republican and conservative.
Do you think if Trump communicated like Reagan, he'd be at 65% approval and we'd be talking about expanding our majorities in the House and the Senate?
Sure, but again, this goes back to the continuum. I think that if he also talked like Reagan, I don't know that he would have differentiated himself. I mean, it's,
right.
When you...
Holding all else
I remember
equal.
when I was in college, we'd have these economic theories and someone would say, okay, if you hold this constant, you say, but that's ridiculous. You can't hold that one piece of the economy constant. It's sort of looking at someone and saying, I think that Trump, if he did a little bit more, a little bit more assuaging of some of these groups, sure, we could be growing. But then I don't know that it would still be the same Trump that got himself elected. I mean,
it's one of those things. If he was different, he wouldn't be the same.
Correct.
Right.
Right.
Right. Exactly. So it's sort of an imponderable. I can see the point. With respect to the midterms, though, and control of the Hill, particularly the House, can you give us a sense, without disclosing something you're not allowed or would not be appropriate to disclose, how concerned the Trump administration and the president himself are about the idea of Speaker Nancy Pelosi and an impeachment proceeding?
It's a good question. I can't tell from the president's comments and tweets how concerned he is. I think he actually thinks that the voters are going to go there and get out and maintain it. I don't necessarily share that. I'm very concerned. I'm not crying wolf like a lot of prognosticators. I think we can still, there's a thread that we can do it. We have a 23-seat majority. That's not a lot. We have 60 seats that have a 4% Republican lean, right? So they are what they call an R+4 district. 60 seats are within that margin. Right now, Democrats are overperforming the ballot by 8. So if you realize just that, then we're going to get our clocks cleaned. That's not the only way you can look at a race, though, because there's a lot of races where you have a good, strong incumbent Republican and maybe a newcomer on the Democratic side that just can't beat them. That being said, the playing field on the House tilts to the Democrats massively. They need 23 seats, as I said. Traditionally, in the post-modern era, you need about 31 is where the party in power loses, meaning that at best we should lose 31. Looking back through all of history, that gets even worse. But they need 23, and by every piece of math, we have 40 incumbents that are not running for re-election, 9 chairmen. There's a lot of these seats that you don't have that power of incumbency in. You don't have the person who's got the name ID, who's done the campaigns before, has built up the volunteer base. And so you have an open seat race going head to head. And there's only so much money and resources the national party can spread around. So we were able to maintain a seat in Ohio just this week because we were able to pour a ton of money into it. But you can't do that in 40 or 50 races. It just doesn't have that.
And then a guy in New York gets indicted.
Right. That's, a
wild card.
Right. And those are the things that you have to realize, that we're playing on a very steep uphill playing field right now. And that's not a good place to be. The bigger problem that I see is that all of these people who got out and voted for President Trump last time, I don't see the data showing a clear correlation between them and his agenda. Meaning, if Trump loses a Republican House, all of the goodies stop coming. The House under Nancy Pelosi is never going to pass anything, including naming a post office, that will help Donald Trump. I mean, literally, you'll come to a standstill.
So is that the GOP's job, is to connect the dots?
Unequivocally. You have to understand that all you will do is have a series of investigations, one after another, on every aspect of what Donald Trump had for dinner, how many people have ever, visited Russia, watched a Russian show.
Read Dr. Zhivago.
There you go. We'll add that one on. You just gave one more idea.
Yeah, right.
But I think that's where we're headed, is that we're headed towards a Democratic House that will do nothing that. And what I've tried to tell Republican groups is, if that scares you, then get out there and mobilize the same way that you did last time. Tell your friends, tell your colleagues, tell your coworker, tell your whoever, your relatives and family. They've got to get out there, because right now people aren't seeing that binary choice that they need to. It was easy last cycle when it was Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton. People clearly understand the different directions that the country could go to. I don't think that there's necessarily that same point being made now, that he may not be on the ballot and it may not be Hillary Clinton, but it is certainly his agenda. And whether or not you like what you see getting done right now, if you do, you have to recognize that it will come to a screeching halt if the Democrats take control of the House. Screeching.
Do you agree that the real opportunity for the Republican Party in terms of unity, dispensing with some of the ancillary never-Trumpers who focus on cult of personality even as they decry it, is conservative reform? You've got somebody who's governing as a conservative reformer in President Trump, generally speaking, with some exceptions, I would argue. You've got the establishment of the party that are conservative reformers. I mean, all of our ascendant governors and senators that competed in the last presidential election are conservative reformers, starting with the names I mentioned previously, Scott Walker and Ted Cruz, and the people that we wish weren't at Purdue University but still in the arena, like Mitch Daniels and the vice president and Eric Holcomb and so many more. And so if we could unify around this conservative reform policy agenda that knows no personality, we'd be much stronger and more robust as a party, and we could start picking up seats in places like the godforsaken state of Illinois that we haven't picked up in some time. It seems to me there's such an opportunity here while the Democrats are speeding off the socialism cliff, is that maybe that's the frame that all hands on deck in the GOP should be trying to make.
I think that's right. I think the hardest part, and I experienced this during 6 years of the party, is that it's impossible to get 10 of these guys on the same page, never mind 300. So you get governors, each of them that wants to do it their own way in each of their states. You've got United States senators that all think that they've got a better way of communicating and talking about priorities. And then obviously in the House. So I don't disagree. I mean, the last time that we effectively did it was 1993, heading into the 94 elections, where everyone got on board with the contract with America. Even then, I mean, the guy that I was doing the race for in Connecticut went and signed the thing, and we really didn't know what it was for. But that was the last attempt at wholesale getting folks on board on the same page. Since then, we've cobbled together some things, but that's the closest we've come.
He is spicy, as SNL refers to him, and you laugh at it.
I do.
You chew your 35 pieces of gum every day to it, right?
Well, we're down a little. I'm weaning off.
You're weaning off?
Oh, yeah.
Sean Spicer, the book, The Briefing, New York Times bestseller, communications professor turned Trump press secretary, and now best-selling author. Sean, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it
very much.